All right, hi everyone. Welcome to, I think this is week 5 of the HCDE Research Discussion Seminar. So today's talk will have Professor Sean Munson. Sean started in 2012, is that right?
Sounds right.
Sounds right, yeah. So he started as assistant professor, primarily focusing on designing for health informatics and personal informatics and personal tracking. And I've had the great fortune of collaborating with Sean on a number of really wonderful projects. We've co-advised some students together. He's always one of the most incredibly thoughtful and principled researchers that I've had the opportunity to collaborate with. Also, if you're PhD students, you might have had the joy of having him as the PhD chair of the department as well, too. So really thoughtful in terms of both his research and his mentoring. And so he'll be talking a bit about a summary of some of the research and some of the implications around personal health data and thinking about designing for goals, reflection, and collaboration. So thank you, Sean.
Cool, thanks. So as Julie said, this is really just a sneaky extra talk about Julie's research. No. Good afternoon. Thanks for being here. Thank you, Julie, for the intro. To get started, I want to briefly introduce the area in which I conduct most of my research. And so many of you probably have already used, you know people who use, or you have encountered sensors and other ways of tracking things about your daily life. This could be your health and well-being. This could be your personal finances. This could be your mood, which is kind of well-being, but sometimes not, right? All these other things. And it involves, so many things in daily life require understanding the way that our behaviors affect outcomes, the way that our context around us affects our behaviors and also affects our outcomes. And if we don't have a good model of that, it can be very difficult to know what to do to kind of achieve the wellness or other kinds of forms of well-being that we want. And so whether this is health promotion or being physically active, there's a process that kind of broadly describes what people might do to understand their health and well-being. And this is the model of personal informatics. It's from other researchers. But the idea is that at the beginning you prepare, so you might buy a Fitbit if you're interested in trying to understand when to be more physically active. You might get a notebook where you're going to record what you do or your daily calendar. You might get a pedometer because you're still trying to figure out what to use. You might start collecting the data. And then at some point in most systems, either the system does it for you or you have to do it, where you put this information together to understand what are the opportunities. And so maybe you say, maybe that 10 episodes of Netflix was too many episodes. I could have stopped at 8 and I could have gone for a walk that day or something like that. And so the idea is that you find these opportunities to take action and then supposedly you do. It turns out that this often doesn't go the way that we want it to. There's a lot of challenges that happen so imagine another context where you might be trying to understand some things about your health and well-being. And so let's say that you get terrible GI symptoms and you start trying to say, okay, maybe there's some other problem or something's contributing to it. You see, does coffee cause a problem? But you always drink your coffee with milk, right? Or you drink more coffee when you're stressed to stay awake. And so you find that, maybe caffeine is correlating, but it could also be the lactose in the milk. Maybe it's the stress, right? And so it's often very difficult for people to tease apart what is causing their outcomes or what the opportunities are. And so they need more tools for this. And so I have 4 goals for today. One is to talk about the assumptions that are present in a lot of the systems that are out there right now to support this kind of personal informatics process. The second is to talk about opportunities to better scaffold the process that start to break down or get away from some of these assumptions. And then also to emphasize that these are not just personal tools, right? The personal informatics makes us think about people kind of as solitary trackers, but often the tracking and often the behaviors being tracked are not individual. And then I also want to talk a little bit about goal-directed approaches as one of the ways to solve this, and then say, but we should also be a little bit cautious about this whole idea. One other thing I want to mention is that today I'm going to talk about a lot of work beyond my own work. This is an area in which I just very much see a lot of good effort from people engaging in tracking, a lot of support from their health clinicians, from their family members, and still not always a lot of good outcomes. I think research actually has a lot to offer about how to do this better. And so by talking about a range of work today, I hope that we can just have some of these good projects out there in the world faster. So one of the things that I particularly appreciate about Ian Lee's model of stage-based personal informatics is that the things that go wrong early often lead to later problems. So if you have a question and you start saying, I'm going to track with one kind of technology or tool, I'm going to track these data, but you don't track all the data you need to answer your question, by the time you get to putting it together and reflecting on it, you don't have the information you need and you have to start over, right? And so that's incredibly frustrating for folks. And it's not always just about the wrong data. It could be about tracking it in a way that is hard to put together. So if we go back to that person who was using their Fitbit, yeah, they get some graphs in time, but if they don't have a way to line that up with their calendar of what else they were doing at that time, they've got either, at best, they've got a lot of work to do to make sense of, where were the opportunities to change their behavior, but they may not ever be able to put it together and may not be able to get kind of the insights they were seeking. And so there certainly are barriers, right? And so tracking can be burdensome. It's a lot of work to record data. Even things like just keeping a Fitbit charged and remembering to wear it is work. And every time you don't do that, you get missing data, and that makes it harder to draw the conclusions you want. As I mentioned, people often track the wrong data for their questions or their goals, and then only realize later on after they've spent a lot of effort, and it's hard to go back and fix that. Combining data from those different tools can require technical expertise, right? So a lot of the early folks who did this well were data scientists or had some stats experience or at least spent an awful lot of time in Excel or sheets like that. And that's not available to everyone. And so that means that the benefits of these tools are not available to everyone. Data can also be really difficult to make sense of. So I mentioned that issue with, is it the coffee, is it the caffeine, is it the milk, or is it that you're drinking this when you're stressed? So it often requires some sort of domain expertise to understand what are the possible causes. It also requires some experimental design expertise to understand how to separate confounds and things like that. And again, this just keeps all of these tools from being as available to people as they could be. And so often this ends up with people starting to track, doing a lot of work, and abandoning it and throwing out their tools without ever having met their goals. And as designers, that should bother us, right? Like, we should not be satisfied with people going through all this work, all this labor, spending money, buying our products, and not getting the value that they've been promised. And we've seen some really good efforts to address some of these barriers. So there's a whole bunch of folks over in computer science and electrical engineering who keep getting better and better at things that we can sense, and that reduces the workload and the barriers. It does lead to more data, but it is nice that we can now automatically sense a lot of things, and that has reduced some of the burdens. We've also had some tools that support automatic integration of sensor data. We also see open standards that help pull data together from different health apps and health systems, as well as on most of our mobile devices or platforms now, there are health data libraries that can at least pull in data from multiple sources and potentially help be a warehouse that people can use to make sense of it. And we've also seen various tools that try and help automatically analyze people's data for them, drawing out actionable insights or opportunities where they could go ahead and act, right? So despite a lot of barriers, there has been effort to try and break them down and overcome them in our designs. And so you might say, if we put all of these efforts together, have we reached a point where we have this nice, reliable approach to design of personal informatics systems? Do things go the way that they want? And I think we're really kind of on the cusp of a lot of broad success here. But again, in many cases, people still run into trouble getting the value they want because of some of the assumptions that are built into the design of these systems. So one of the problems is there's this assumption that more data are better. And I think this particularly shows up where we start having, now that we can, for free, or you buy a device and it does it for you, sense a lot of things using wearables, using data traces through your phone, using your financial traces, using your calendar, right? And just importing all that. We're like, oh yeah, more data. Surely the answer is somewhere in there. And it's very tempting to think that this is a solution. On the other hand, giving people more data also creates this feeling for people of more work, right? So surely now that I have this responsibility to figure out how I'm supposed to manage my health because I have all this data at my fingertips. There's also been some work that shows that if you give people more data to see their problems, but you don't give them designs that help them identify solutions or actions that they can reasonably take, they start just experiencing that they have a lot more problems, right? And so in psychiatry, this is called rumination, where you're just like, oh, now I've got this problem and I'm kind of dwelling on it. And so if we've just built these rumination machines, we're also kind of not only not helping people, we're kind of actively making their days worse. And this is work by Elizabeth Ike that helped inform this. Right, and then Anchor points out that you get reminded you're a sick person if you use a lot of these tools in chronic conditions, right? And so it often is this reminder of the negative and not enough support of what to do about it. And so one approach that can really address this is reduction in focus. So what is the thing that someone's going to be able to work on right now? Can we give them tools that just track that just help them analyze it, that help them think about the actions that they could take? And if you provide them with some support for that, they're not being reminded of their 10,000 problems. They're focusing on the one that they're committed to working on, and they're hopefully getting some in-the-moment support. Another assumption that I think we see a lot in consumer products, and some of this is tied to their business model. If you're a device manufacturer and your device promises to help people become more physically active, people are going to stop using your device if they don't develop a dependency on it, right? And so this can be applying to things like Fitbits or things like that, right? Either you start offering them more value by solving more problems, or maybe they just kind of have to be dependent on this awareness forever, right? And that can lead us away from designs that do things like encourage people to develop sustainable habits for physical activity, as an example. And so there may be times, I think, when tracking forever is appropriate, but as a designer, I really want to challenge us to think about how designs can go in, help people with whatever question they have in the moment, and kind of help them move on from it, right? Where they've developed some sustainable habit and can then say, okay, this is now part of my life, and maybe the technology goes away or it fades into the background and is there to kind of say, oh, you've started to deviate from your goals, time to check in again, but isn't always asking their attention. Right? And so we need to design for lapses, for changes in priorities, and also for when people achieve their goals, right? If someone achieves their goals, celebrate and have them move on rather than saying, oh, but please keep using me, I'm your Fitbit, I miss you, right? There's another challenge that shows up in personal informatics systems where people go and say that certain goals imply certain data, or to flip it, and this shows up in healthy eating, for example. So people say, oh, someone wants to eat more healthily, and therefore we must track calories. Turns out if you actually ask people what healthy eating is, calories is way down on this list. People are talking about things like, oh, I want a balanced meal, I want my fruits and vegetables, I know I have this deficiency in this nutrient, so I'm going to work on that. Right? Calories is not up there for most people in healthy eating. When you ask about it, it's the first thing that apps tend to go to. And we know from all sorts of work in eating that, yeah, calorie tracking can be valuable for some people, but it's not valuable for everyone. It can be actively harmful to other people. And so these apps kind of put people who start with the broad healthy eating goal by default into this mode of calorie counting, which may not be what they need or may actually be hurting them. There's a flip side of this, which is that certain data always imply certain goals. And so this shows up a lot in period tracking apps, or at least it used to, where if people are tracking their period, there is often this assumption that it's around either becoming pregnant or not wanting to become pregnant. However, there's lots of other reasons people might want to track their periods. And for people who can't become pregnant or for whom that's not one of the things that's on their mind, constantly sending these fertility messages makes the app an aversive experience. I'm really happy that since we did this work in 2015, that apps have started to say, do you want this information? No? Okay, you can turn it off, right? It's such a simple solution, but it wasn't there 9 years ago. Okay, so this does require some challenges. And so one of those is that it requires people to still know what kind of data will best support their goals. And sometimes people know that. However, for chronic conditions or other complex problems, people may not know what data might speak to it. It takes some domain expertise, like if you're working on GI disorders, you might need to know what nutrients are likely to trigger GI symptoms, what kinds of other things contribute to GI symptoms. If you're working on migraine, that's even more complex, as I'll get to. And so often people need some support here to actually figure out what is reasonable to track. And also, as we've learned, people also need some support to learn how much can they reasonably track without burning out, right? Someone who's new to tracking may not know that from the start. And so now we're starting to catch up with a lot of the work that my group has done in the past few years in this area of goal-directed self-tracking. And so broadly, the idea is that instead of having people come into an app and assume that they're there because they have exactly this goal, when they're in the app, you start saying, well, what is your goal? Or you start bifurcating the app design or the features according to the goals that someone expresses. And then you can scaffold a tracking process that corresponds to that goal and support analyses that also correspond, right? So once you know what someone's trying to do with your app, you can give them a much better experience. And I always want to say that goal-directed design is not new. And you might think about it actually as akin to publishing software, right? And so if you open a word processor, you have this flexible, expressive publishing app. It's awesome. You can do a lot with it. However, if someone brings in a particular goal, like they want to make a calendar that features 12 photos of their 12 most beautiful photos of their cats, doing that in Word without any scaffolding is actually a huge pain, right, for most people. But you can bring in a tool that actually scaffolds it and says, maybe, here's a template for building a calendar, so they just have to replace the images. They don't have to worry about, what day does the year start on or stuff like that. They remember all the months. That's great. Maybe it has some holidays on it, right? And so you can make this a lot easier for people. Alternatively, there's probably hundreds of websites out there where you can go and be like, I want a calendar, just let me put in my cat pictures. But we also know from the world of publishing that when we start butting in and trying to talk with people about their goals with design, it doesn't always go well, right? Clippy was kind of interesting, kind of annoying. I think with AI we're seeing some other attempts at this where sometimes it's like spot on and sometimes it's like, oh, that is not what I wanted to do there. And so I think even though we've made advances here, this goal-directed space is still quite hard. And so to bring it back to personal informatics, I've talked a little bit about GI symptoms, and one condition that can lead to a lot of GI symptoms is irritable bowel syndrome. And that's characterized by episodic abdominal pain with diarrhea or constipation. Consequences, for people's lives mean that it can be hard to participate socially, right? If you don't know how you're going to feel, it can be really difficult to be fully present. You're worried about going out to social events. People miss work. It affects about 20% of the U.S. population. And the common approach to managing this is to identify individualized triggers and manage symptoms. The current practice for it, however, as actually what people have to go through, is quite difficult and miserable. And so it often involves people getting told to take a food journal, and they might do that on paper or on a computer. They collect their data, they annotate it, they get these sheets where they're writing things down. You can already kind of start to imagine how this is not going to go well when they get to the later stages of the process, right? You've got all these pages of food diary. Has anyone here ever kept a food diary? Yeah, so would anyone say it was enjoyable? Right, yeah, it's a lot of work. And also, if you're trying to look for patterns in it rather than just kind of an awareness, it gets even more difficult because you have to go and take all these pages and try and put them together later for signal. People can do this where they try and get help from clinicians, but we've done work where if you take food diaries to a very well-trained, very well-meaning clinician, the same clinician across different patients tends to make the same recommendation based on what's worked for their past patients. If you take the same food diary to different, very well-meaning, very well-trained clinicians, they all tend to make different recommendations, which tells you that there's a really big problem with getting the signal out of those paper diaries and into something that people can understand. All right, so integration, a challenge, reflection. If you can't integrate, it's not going to go well. And often where people get to is they go through all this work, and it's like, well, there's no clear signal in here, so how about you have a diet of chicken and rice? And that's also not fun, not so great for social participation. It's also can be challenging for health, right? And so this is super frustrating for folks. Okay, so can we do better? And so in an ideal world, we start by asking what you already know or suspect. By the time someone engages a clinician about their GI symptoms, they probably already have some ideas about what might be causing it, right? And so ask people what they know. This happens less often than you would think. All right, so maybe someone wants to identify potential symptom contributors across one's typical eating. Right, they start with a more open-ended question. We might have them do a photo-based food diary where they take pictures of their food. This is way less burdensome than writing everything down. When we showed this to clinicians, folks were concerned that they wouldn't get enough signal from it. And in particular with IBS, there's certain kinds of things like what kind of milk you use, what kinds of fat you use for cooking, that affect whether someone's likely to experience symptoms. And so we did have to add some questions to the end about, what was this cooked in or things like that for things that maybe people couldn't get from the photo. But we were pleasantly surprised that dietitians could actually get a lot of signal from it. We then look at it on a grid where you just sort the photos by what symptoms people later experienced, and you look for trends. We had another variation of this where we built some fairly complex visualizations. I won't go into these today, but one of the really interesting things here is that a lot of people think people can't do visualizations. It turns out that by grounding these visualizations in people's actual data and building a little bit of tutorial around it, people could work with visualizations they'd never seen before, which is kind of encouraging, right? They had that anchoring in their own experiences to say, oh, this makes sense to me or not. Okay. So from this photo, they might start to get hypotheses. All right, the set of photos, they might start to get hypotheses. And so they can make changes and see if improvements results. Or if, for example, they say, oh, looks like coffee is going to be my trigger. And we talked about the confounds. We live in Seattle. A lot of people are pretty attached to their coffee, especially when it gets dark in winter. They might want more evidence, and so they might want to go forward with testing a hypothesis. And so for those folks, we might put them into a process where they go through self-experimentation. So they come in and say, I have a particular hypothesis I want to test, which is that it's caffeine that is a trigger for me. This sets up an experience. Actually, in this case, it's someone with lactose or dairy, sorry. So they say, I want to track my abdominal pain and my bloating or gas. These are my top symptoms. We're not going to track all of them, just the ones that you're paying attention to. They want to track the effect of lactose and dairy. And then it designs for them an experiment where over 14 days, they eat the same breakfast every day, except they vary whether or not they have lactose in that breakfast, right? So we're holding that steady. And then they report their symptoms 4 hours later. The nice thing about this is that you can then go about the rest of your day kind of as you normally would. Breakfast for most people is the least social and the most routine meal, so it's the best one to kind of start tweaking with experiments. It's not so great if you think like alcohol is your trigger, but for a lot of things, breakfast works pretty well. All right, so they track their symptoms, and then at the end they get a report that gives them some information about, I've switched back to caffeine, where it looks like on caffeine days you had higher abdominal pain, right? And we give them a p-value, which is not the best stats, and happy to chat with you in Q&A about that for it. But it does kind of give them a brief summary of what's going on, and then they can make a decision, right? One of the things we don't do here is say, eat this or don't eat this. We give them information so that they can make informed decisions. Early in this work, I was talking to someone who loved ice cream. I also love ice cream. And they knew it was a food trigger for them. And so they would just have ice cream, but they would have it at a time when they knew they could handle the side effects or the consequences, right? And so the idea here is that by giving people better information, we're supporting their agency rather than saying do this or don't do that. Okay. So overall, this worked. The yes, no, and the effect size was a bit limiting. We have some other work on using different statistical methods that would work better. But the really nice thing is that across these two things, we can start to support different kinds of goals. So someone who has open-ended questions can do the photo-based food diary and get a general sense of what might be causing their symptoms. Someone who has specific questions can use self-experimentation. So we didn't call this goal-directed self-tracking at the time, but already we were starting to say, based on what you already know and the question you have, you need different designs, right? The photo-based food diary is not the right tool for someone who has a very specific hypothesis they want to test. On the other hand, if you don't have a hypothesis, going through a million self-experimentations sounds pretty miserable and exhausting. So again, we've got to get to meet people where they are. Okay. So after that, we started thinking about, can we start putting these ideas together in a single app? And sure, in IBS you could. And we also started thinking about, could you start putting this together with more complex conditions? And so we started some work on migraine, which is even more complex. One of the nice things about IBS is that, it's not if you have it, but one of the nice things about IBS is you tend to experience the symptoms pretty quickly after the food. So you can isolate things much more reliably than with something like migraine, where it may be something that accumulates over a period of days or weeks. It's much more challenging. And additionally, there can be weird interaction effects in migraine and things like that. And so migraine turned out to be a harder context, but we still were able to build a tool that started by asking people, what's the category of goal that you have, and then based on that category, we're going to start saying, okay, let's get to a more specific goal. Okay, I want to learn about my migraine frequency, and then some things that you might want to track based on that. Right? And so we go from these very broad open-ended goals, which is often how people know how to express them when they come into a clinic visit, and start walking them towards more specific things that they can answer using self-tracking. There's also a point in the system where maybe their question couldn't be answered with self-tracking, and then we'd want to say, like, maybe this isn't the tool for you. We first built this out with paper prototyping, and it looked really promising. We also learned some things. And then we moved on to doing this with an interactive field deployment with 10 patients who used the app for an average of about a year each working with the clinician. Over that year, we found that people were able to express different kinds of goals. As they learned things, they could update their goals and change their tracking according to what their new knowledge. And they also were able to use this to better communicate with their clinicians about what was going on for them, about what they needed, and also to take actions and adjust kind of the way they were managing migraine or the other parts of their life around it. So this was super successful, and I think is really a nice model for what we can do in chronic condition management. One of the things that people often ask at this stage, and so I'll save you the Q&A, is can you build one of these for all health conditions? And I think, no, I can't. I think it's probably actually very hard. There was a whole lot of domain knowledge about migraine from our clinical partners, from past research that was built into the app, as well as expertise on what we know kind of is reasonable tracking for migraine. So for example, one of the things that can be particularly a problem if you have a migraine is using a screen. And so we had to have kind of ways to manage that. And so all of these things end up super specific to the health concern as well. And so I think actually it's better to have separate apps for these separate kinds of questions, at some point. Okay. I also want to say that this goal-directed design does extend really nicely beyond health. We can see, for example, this in a project that Kai Lukoff led, who's actually giving a talk on VR virtual tour next week in the iSchool, but his dissertation work was on digital well-being. And one of his final projects was looking at YouTube and saying, well, there's all these things on YouTube that take away your attention. You may have experienced this. You go to YouTube to figure out this cooking technique that you've never heard of before, and next thing you know, you've watched 9 cat videos, 3 music videos, and the food is burned or it's too late to eat, so you better order takeout or something like that. Right? And so YouTube is just tremendously bad/good at subverting your attention. And there are times when you want that, right? There are times when maybe you're like, oh, it's time for cat videos, right? And you're off to YouTube. But there's also times when you go there with a different goal. And so Kai's intuition was we could tell you right at the start, what is your goal? Are you here to just kind of hang out, or are you here with a specific goal? And we could strip away all of those distracting interface elements into this more focused mode. And that by just giving people the choice, they had way more satisfaction with YouTube. They didn't actually use it less, but they used it better in their reports. So I thought this was a really cool result, too. All right, so what do I want to say about goal-directed self-tracking? With it, we can scaffold a process to better answer someone's questions or to meet their goals for why they're using software. Goals often start vague, and we need to think about how we can help people express those into more specific goals in our designs fairly often, into answerable questions. And we want to scaffold a scientific process when that's what someone needs, right? And so we can build in that expertise so that the people coming to our apps don't have to be data scientists or people super familiar with the scientific method, and actually can learn a bit about it through their use of the app. One of the opportunities that I think we missed is a little bit more of how do you scaffold based on the insight what you do next. And so I think supporting action in these moments is really important. So now you've got this result. What are some things you could do? So if you learn that a particular, so another common IBS contributor is garlic. Well, it's the emulins in garlic and onion. And turns out there's a lot of recipes that use garlic and onion. And so there are some techniques that you can use that learn how to cook where you still get some of the flavor, substitute ingredients, infusing oil with the flavor, things like that. So you get the flavor without the symptoms. And so building some support for well, now that you've got this result, what do you do next into the app was sort of a missed opportunity. The clinicians provided a lot of it in our studies. And I also think that tools could still, we've got some early results that show that tools can evolve with people's goals evolving. But I think this is also an under sort of tapped area in design. Okay. So I want to go back briefly to our assumptions. I mentioned early on that one of the things I would talk about is how personal informatics are often assumed to be this personal and individualized process. But if we look at what someone's going on as they're navigating health, they're often working with clinicians, they're often working with peers or peer support communities, they're also often having to work with family and friends who might be part of their eating and also need to learn how to adapt how they cook or things like that, and also just part of their support network. And so even when we were using our IBS apps, we saw that people had these different goals and they would go to engage their clinicians. But in reality, a lot of clinicians are really trained on a different set of goals than maybe people had. So we've got some people here who, they want to reduce symptom severity and frequency. They love their favorite foods. They want to understand the relationship between food symptoms and cut out the ones that have the greatest effect. We've got someone else who wants to maintain a balanced diet. But whenever they would go to work with the clinician would kind of default to this, what's going to get you to the fewest symptoms and the least severe symptoms as possible, even though people would, as in the ice cream example, still accept some symptoms because they're things they love about food. And so here we found that just giving people a template where they summarized their goal for the visit, what they already knew, and their top questions really centered this on what someone wanted, right? So if someone had used our app and they said, it looks like this might be a trigger, I'm still going to eat it sometimes, what can I do to reduce the symptom severity or things like that, then the clinician could give them better advice. And so kind of making room for these inputs was really valuable for centering the conversation around the patient's goals. The other thing that I kind of want to think about is where, I mentioned before the kinds of expertise that people need to make this go well. And so I mentioned that to do the migraine goal-directed self-tracking, we had to have a lot of domain or clinical expertise. We had to have a lot of process expertise about how does tracking go, how does analysis go built into the app. And then individuals had to know what was going on in their own life to be able to bring the problems that were relevant to them and take it out into their daily lives. And so with each of these apps, we sort of hit a different spot. In the IBS app, we were kind of a little bit closer to the individual providing the lived experience. And the app was providing the process expertise and the clinicians were supporting with the domain expertise. As we've moved into migraine, we've been able to build a lot more of that clinical expertise into the app, which is great for supporting engagement and use over time, right? And so that was largely through the work of talking with clinicians about, okay, what might someone track based on their questions and how can we scaffold that process? All right. I'm going to jump ahead a little. So I also want to mention families, right? So families also come up as super important in the way that we behave, right? So if you're trying to change your eating, the people you live with, who might do some or more of the cooking, right, or who just have demands on what you eat, have an effect on what you choose to eat. Families also often pursue shared goals, including around physical activity. They might have interests that interfere with each other's goals. Someone might love hiking, someone might prefer not hiking, right? And so you have these challenges of, what do you do if you have these different ways of doing it? And also effects that one person experiences can ripple across the family, right? If one person is stressed, and this isn't just families, it can also be roommates, right, who you live with, is stressed, the other people also tend to experience some of that stress. And they also coordinate and share work. And so there's an opportunity here designed for families as well that help make these different effects visible across families. And so that people can say, oh, you're experiencing the stress, maybe I can step up and pick it up, and you can do this with things like sleep. There's also times, however, when maybe you don't want to talk about it. And so I think this is still sort of a big design challenge. And I just want to highlight, right, that even when we're talking about personal goals, it's often in the shared context, and there may be shared goals as well. And I think that's a sort of an area where personal informatics doesn't go great yet. Okay. One of the other things we saw that was maybe not around the shared goals space, but was around, back to our IBS work, was that tracking became a way to help have some of these conversations in families. So people would say, with IBS, one of the really unfortunate things is that because people may not have great evidence that something contributes to their symptoms, they can have difficulty having conversations with people around them about saying, oh, I have this food intolerance, right? And you probably have seen people roll their eyes, oh, food intolerance, right? Because it's sort of this nebulous and you don't have great evidence. And people like their food and they perceive it as extra work. And one of the sort of unexpected benefits of the tools that we built for IBS is that people were saying, oh, I took this result to my family and I could show them, look, every time I ate this food, I had these symptoms, or this is how much it seems to affect my abdominal pain, so maybe we could make some adjustments. I do not love the fact that people had to create this evidence or had to have this evidence to communicate with their friends and families about it. But given that that was the situation they were in, it was this nice side effect where it also helped people have this artifact to communicate. Even people would talk about this with their clinicians, right? A clinician would be like, oh, I don't believe that that could be the cause. And then they'd bring in their results and they'd say, hear back, oh, okay, I see, it looks like it is. And sometimes that would be a starting point for another conversation of, okay, maybe there's a confound here that we can tease apart. But again, just the ability to communicate this conversation among folks was really important. Okay, another place where we have this shared form of tracking is in athletic teams that are increasingly adapting personal informatics tools, right? And they tend to use them in training. And they're often brought in with this idea that they're going to increase safety, they're going to help you avoid overtraining, and they're going to promote individual safety. However, this very quickly starts spilling over to enforcing team norms, right? So in high-performance athletic organizations, you're supposed to get your sleep, you're supposed to go to practice, you're supposed to do your things outside of formal practice. And when you have tools that can bring data from all of those places in, it becomes sort of surveillant, right? Again, it starts with this good goal of, great, we're going to see how we're doing, and we're not going to overtrain you, and starts to lead into like, well, maybe, if you went out to a party and you're a college athlete, or you stayed up late to do your homework, well, maybe you're going to be benched in the upcoming game. And people worry about, or athletes worry about these sort of reprisals or effects. And this tracking has always been there, but it has previously been there in the form of self-report. And, with self-report, you can lie, right? Or blur the truth a little bit. And everyone knew that, right? Everyone knew this was happening. But when you introduce the technology, you start getting this idea that it's more objective and more real, which isn't always true because, and so you'd have coaches that trusted it more, which is dangerous for the athletes if they assume that when someone says they slept, that they slept, and you start running the risk of overtraining them, because what's actually happening is that athlete is giving their Fitbit to their roommate who is going to stay at home on the couch and watch a movie and going out to the party, right? Because, people still are going to live their lives. And so figuring out kind of designs that do achieve these safety benefits without kind of turning into these surveillance apparatuses that people have to get around, I think is an ongoing challenge here. And this shows up in other contexts like monitoring drivers, where again, I am all for thinking about how we better monitor drivers for safety and health, but then you start getting into driver monitoring for like, can you deliver your packages fast enough? And you start getting these other pressures creeping in that are super harmful, or people who are scared to take like pee breaks while they're driving, and that's really inhumane. Monitoring your home, again, often starts with these auspiciously good intentions, and then in interviews that students did with people who were using smart home cameras, they'd start hearing back of like, and then I'd start turning to my kids and be like, well, let's check the tape, right? Every time they said something, and then like, well, what am I doing? What have I become, right? Rather than having kind of these conversations in which, maybe it's okay if the kids lie. And we also see this with menstrual health data post-Roe v. Wade, and where the health data recorded by consumer apps can put you at risk, crossing state lines for an abortion. If you're in an Epic shop, that data is still available across the Epic line. Right? So it's just like all these things that started with good intention, the data bleed into these other uses. Okay. So I also, to close, I've said a lot of good things about personal informatics. We're starting to get into the but I've got some misgivings or things can go badly. I want to close by talking a little about some reasons why maybe not to get too excited. And so we've got these great ideas for healthy eating. We can do a photo-based food diary similar to our IBS app to support healthy eating goals. That works pretty well. But it still gets people really focused on the data. And one of the questions that we asked was, can we step back and actually just design for experiences? And so we built this other app that just gave people a daily challenge. And it could be nutrition related, eat this much fiber, or it could be a little bit playful, like eat something an elephant would eat. And it turned out that the engagement was way better with eat something an elephant would eat, and it turns out that people also did at least as well on improving their food mindfulness, which is also a good predictor of healthy eating, because they're thinking about their food, they're not finding it this aversive nutrition work-related challenge. And so, data aren't always the answer here, and sometimes we can design experiences that are more fun, people can stick with longer, and they can enjoy. I'm not sure that everything is suitable for an experience, right? Or at least it's going to take more designers more creative than me to get there, right? So I don't know what the save more money experience is. Maybe gamification, but I'm not super thrilled about that. Or the be a better worker, be more productive experience, right? So it's not always going to be about this, or the migraine experience. But I think that there are opportunities here to think about, do we always really need to immerse people in the data, or do we just find ways to make living life a little more mindful? The other really big hesitation I have with personal informatics is that often these are patches on societal problems, right? I'm not talking here about migraine. I'm not talking about chronic conditions where having an understanding can help you better manage it and live your life, or at least I'm not talking about most chronic conditions. But I'm talking about, as we start moving into the behavior change space of let's use personal informatics to save more, let's use personal informatics to eat better. When you experience significant upstream barriers to earning more, living, or getting a living wage, or when you experience significant upstream barriers to healthy eating, like you don't have access to healthy foods or they're too prohibitively expensive for you, no amount of reflecting harder or better is going to fix that, right? It's just going to make people feel awful, and it's going to shift. When we build tools like this, it shifts our rhetoric from societal responsibility onto individual responsibility when it's not really always appropriate. There are some really cool alternatives out there that show how we can use personal informatics to start addressing these upstream barriers. And so I'm going to talk about one of my favorite personal informatics projects, which is not at all mine, but I think is just really inspiring. And this is working in asthma. And so asthma is a chronic condition. It's something that your contextual and environmental factors affect. We know that it disproportionately affects people from marginalized backgrounds and in marginalized communities. And so just giving everyone tools and saying, work harder at managing your asthma is just going to perpetuate a whole bunch of inequity. And so in this other project, they take these Bluetooth-connected inhalers, and every time someone uses a rescue inhaler, so they're having an asthma attack, it logs the location and sends in a report. This was conducted in Louisville, Kentucky. And so you can all imagine all sorts of individual uses for this, right? So you're starting to say, oh, maybe I should avoid this area because it has triggers for my asthma or stuff like that. But in addition to looking at the personal level, they started looking at the community level. And they started saying, well, what if we map this to some of our possible causes of asthma? And so in 2014, Louisville was one of the 20 hardest places in the US to live with asthma. And they started saying, well, we want to support individual action, right? People have these asthma attacks, they need to deal with it. They could take the rescue inhaler. But they took the data from where that was and started overlaying it with point emission sources. They started overlaying it with areas that didn't have enough tree cover. And they started using it to plant trees and to address problems with like, whoa, it seems like there's a lot of pollution here that seems to be triggering asthma attacks. We really should prioritize this for action. And so I think this is really beautiful, where they're providing people with tools in the moment to do something about the problem. And then they're saying, but we are not going to leave it to people to always have to deal with this on their own. We are going to start addressing this as a city. Right? And so when we think about the layers at which we're working, there's so many opportunities here to start saying, yes, we can give you in-the-moment support, but we need to start saying, what does this teach us about what's going on in your local setting, in your community, in our country, and start using that to say, okay, let's start prioritizing some of the changes that we can make that will make meaningful differences, so it's not always on the individual. Okay, so to summarize this wide-ranging tour, there are a lot of assumptions in current tools, and some of those are that more data are better, that people will track indefinitely, and that certain goals always imply certain data. And I think we have some really good design techniques at the individual level for breaking past that. I think that when we start thinking about personal informatics as being beyond the individual, we have some promising designs and we have some people using individual tools really well collaboratively. But I think that figuring out the kinds of designs that support collaboration around data with people of different expertise or with different goals is still a really big challenge for designers and researchers. And then I think the grand challenge that I really want to throw us out there is that we can and should find ways to use these tools to help people in the moment or support people in the moment, but don't leave all of that responsibility on them, and make sure that we don't shift the responsibility to people just because they have the ability to individually manage it. But as a society, take that data in responsible and privacy-preserving ways and use it to mean that fewer people experiences those hardships in the future. Had a lot of really great collaborators on this project over the years, many of whom are in the room, many of whom are now faculty or in industry elsewhere. And I'll just say thank you and move to questions.